to talk about was the expansion for choices in worship in Old Dartmouth at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. But that's not exactly what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, well, we're going to go back and review a little the 18th century. And I had this beautiful picture of William Allen Wall painted actually of the fishery at Westport. And so he portrayed a very calm seacoast life here. But in the middle 1700s, religious life was not all that calm around. So we're going to begin with a review, and that is that in 1723 and 24, and you heard this the last time we talked together, there was the first civil rights case in the colonies. And once again, the people of Old Dartmouth and New Bedford don't get the credit for this when they started in civil rights in this country, but this really was the first civil rights case, and it was a case about religious freedom because Phil Tabor, who was a Baptist minister, and Joseph Aiken and Joseph Anthony and John Sisson, who were all Quakers, were assessors, and they refused to collect the taxes imposed by the General Court of Massachusetts for the maintenance of ministers of the state-sponsored church now known as Congregational, and for this they were all imprisoned. And they petitioned King George. Of the three King Georges, this was the first King George. It's real easy to remember because King George the First was king for the first third of the century. King George the Second was the king during the French and Indian War, and King George the Third was at the end during the Revolutionary War. So at the beginning, what he is famous for is he said that the people, the Quakers and the Baptists, who did not want to pay that portion of their tax that went to support the congregational minister, didn't need to, and that the assessors should be immediately released from imprisonment. So far, so good. I put in a few comments in red. Variety of choices for worship. Okay. Now, if we lived in Russell's Mills, we could go to Apponeganset, which is 0.8 of a mile, to worship with the Quakers, or we could go to the Baptist Church in Tiverton, where the family of many of the family members of Paul Cuffey went to church, 9.5 miles, or we'd have to go all the way to go to the official church, we'd have to go 11 miles. Okay. But what we wanted to do was to talk tonight about a man who didn't really live in our town, but actually because he moved to Middleborough, he lived kind of close to us, and every American needs to know him. He was very influential in the religion of Old Dartmouth and indeed in the entire United States, okay? And I've been told all about his mother already, that due partially to, I'm going skipping down because it told about how her hope was restored after her husband died because of the First Great Awakening. And after that occasion, she became one of the most fervent of the revival enthusiasts, and her home became a center for prayer meetings and religious exhorting. And due partly to his mother's faith, he gave his life to Christ and found new hope. So he came up to Middleborough, to the Baptist Church in 1751, and became the pastor there. But from there, he became the leading spokesman for the fastest growing religious group in 18th century America, which at the time were the Baptists. And in 1764, he joined John Brown and Nicholas Brown, who were brothers of the Quaker Moses Brown that we all know from the Moses Brown School. But John Brown and Nicholas were Baptists, and they chartered the college in the English colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, which was the original name for Brown University, and Isaac Backus was one of the trustees. I don't know how they got around to be in Middleborough and have to run over for a trustees meeting, you know. But anyway. So, it was in Warren. I've been to the room. I've been to the church. Yes, it was in Warren. But even then, that's not that close. Yeah, it still is. It's still, okay. Now, but King George's ruling, which we saw was honored here in Dartmouth and the assessors went free, was not honored in the rest of the colonies. Because in 1774, which was just before the Revolutionary War, in Northampton, Massachusetts, 18 Baptists were jailed, refusing to pay taxes for the support of the town's congregational minister. Sometimes we tell this story as if it only happened here. This also happened in Virginia, where Anglicanism, that was later renamed Episcopalianism, was the established church. So just like here, we had to collect taxes for the Congregational Church in Virginia. everybody had to pay to support the Anglicans. So in 1774, of course, just before the Revolutionary War, James Madison was already a leader, and he thought it was a terrible thing that, that there was so much discrimination against the Baptists and the other kinds of Christians. And so he said this was diabolical, and hell-conceived principle of persecution rages among some. There are at this time in the adjacent county not less than 5 or 6 well-meaning men in close jail for publishing their religious sentiments, which in the main are very orthodox. So I must beg you to pray for liberty of conscience for all. Not that they really listened to him, but that was what James Madison was saying, because he was also a leader in the colony as well as a leader in what became the whole country. Okay. So there was a timeline. In 1770, Baptists presented petitions for the removal of restrictions placed on them. Then in 1775, in Virginia, they presented petitions calling for the abolishment of the established church. They got 10,000 signatures, and some Presbyterians and some Episcopalians signed on. And they gave the Baptists some freedom. And then in 1776, Virginia, so this is, just at the time of the Declaration of Independence, Virginia disestablished the Church of England. So that meant that it was no longer the established church. So dissenters were exempted from attending church and didn't have to pay taxes to the church. And they were allowed to publicly voice their religious sentiments, but there was still no complete separation of church and state. So the Baptists were still not happy, and they were still persecuted. Now remember that Jefferson also lived in Virginia, and he wrote a bill for religious freedom in 1777, which was the time of the Battle of Saratoga, the turning point of the Revolutionary War. So life was going on while there was a war on. Jefferson in Virginia declared no man should be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship place or ministry whatsoever. So he wrote that, but then he had to go to Paris, remember, during the Revolutionary War, to be our ambassador. So he left James Madison to try to push the bill through the Virginian legislature. Okay. Now, the Baptists continued to insist on a full religious liberty and separation of church and state in Virginia, and John Leland went down from Massachusetts. He was a popular minister who supported Jefferson's religious freedom bill, and he led the Baptist agitation for separation of church and state. And by this time, a number of denominations were willing to compromise by decreeing just a general religious tax, but the Baptists refused. So finally, in 1786, Virginia established religious freedom. But then the Baptists were now looking ahead to the federal Constitution, because they were starting to write the Constitution. The war was over, and the Baptists complained that the new Constitution did not make any provision for religious liberty. So the Baptists had a new cause. Okay. Now, John Leland was raised in New England, and he went down to Virginia to help the Baptists, just as the tension between the Anglican Church and the Baptists were mounting. So what I'm actually saying tonight is there were two Massachusetts men who went down working on religious freedom, and one was Isaac Backus of Middleborough, and one was John Leland. Now, Leland became a key player in the so-called Virginia experience, where he found strong allies in James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and it was an unlikely alliance. He was a fervent evangelical intent on spreading the good news of the gospel and believing that a person needed to be born again. Leland was convinced that the church must be protected from interference and incursions of the state. Now, Madison and Jefferson also shared a passionate belief in religious liberty, and what it says in the part that doesn't show is that they believed that the state needed to be separated from religion, so religious people like John Leland couldn't go around influencing everybody. So they actually believed the opposite about religion, but they both believed that people should have the freedom to say and believe what they wanted. And this is a picture of John Leland, who said, "Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely and see that one does not abuse another. The liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians." So this is the first reference to Muslims and to the Muslim faith that is actually written down. So now we got to the Constitution of the United States. You remember that it was passed in 1787 and it didn't have any Bill of Rights. It was passed by the people that wrote it, affirmed it in the Constitutional Convention. But they did get through that statement for religious freedom in Virginia that Thomas Jefferson had written. And it was a statement of freedom of conscience and also the principle of separation of church and state. So those two things, one happened in 86 and one happened the next year in 87. And in 88, Massachusetts did ratify the Constitution. And its example ensured that the Constitution would be speedily adopted by most of the states that had not already done so, because Massachusetts was considered a leadership state like Virginia. How come Massachusetts ratified the Constitution? It was because of the pastor of Old Dartmouth of the Precinct Church, Samuel West. So that's why I wanted to bring this up. Now just before, go back just once, go back. You see, it says no Bill of Rights. They completed the Constitution without any Bill of Rights. Now if you go to the Massachusetts Constitution, you'll see that the first thing is the Bill of Rights, and the rest is how to run the state. But the Constitution just is all about how to run the country. Now when people asked how come there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution, they said because all the states have Bills of Rights in their Constitution. Each colony, each new state has a Bill of Rights. So we shouldn't need to have another one in the Constitution. But actually, people came to see that really you needed both in order to really guarantee people's rights. So Samuel West was our delegate. And we told you about Samuel West last time. Remember, he was the chaplain of the Minutemen from Old Dartmouth, and he's the one who decoded the code that the spy, Dr. Church, had made, and George Washington was so pleased that, that he was able to do that. Well, now we have yet another example of what kind of a guy he was, and that's why I wanted to take the time to talk about it tonight. So this is what the old hill looks like, where the meeting house was when Samuel West was the pastor. Okay. And this is what the meeting house looked like. It was a two-story meeting house in the middle of the 1700s. All right. And this is now today, you could see that when they took down the meeting house, they left the grass. So I think that this is where I'm going to try to do this. I think that this is where the meeting house was. This section right in here. You can see it in an old picture in the Acushnet. So that these were up to the edge of the building and those were up to the edge of the building. And then they took down the building and left the space in the middle. Okay. Now there's another picture here, and this is also on that hill in Acushnet. And it's the grave of Lieutenant Metcalf. Some of us know relatives of the Metcalfs. Lois Duckworth is a relative of Lieutenant Metcalf, who was the only person killed in the Battle of New Bedford, and he was the only officer because he was the only officer home. All the other Minutemen were off fighting, so he was home with the few people that were left. They really never expected New Bedford to be attacked. And remember, he was shot at the bridge and buried up here in the churchyard, because the meeting house was still there in that grassy slope. So Samuel West, greatest service to the nation, for all that he was a good pastor here for 40 years, was when he went up to the 1788 Massachusetts Convention to convince John Hancock that they should ratify the new federal Constitution. Now, Governor John Hancock was in the chair, and much of the debate revolved around the Constitution's failure to have the Bill of Rights in it, and also to deal adequately with the rights of the states. What is the 10th Amendment? I'm not sure. Is the 10th Amendment the one that says anything that's not mentioned in here is left to the state?
Right. Yes, reserved to the states.
Reserved to the states. So the rights of the states weren't part. Deal adequately with questions of congregational representation and taxation, and make explicit provision for individual liberties. So now there were 2 delegates up there that we know of. Backus was the delegate from Middleborough, and West was the delegate from here.
Walter Spooner, one of the delegates?
I don't know, we have to look it up.
Richard, you know?
I don't know. I know he was involved with Governor Hancock and the government at the time, so.
I think Walter Spooner had.
We have to see, I don't know how they chose them, or how many you got per town, or was it per population, or, you know, just how you got chosen. I couldn't figure that out. But vigorous debate continued, and the convention was nearly evenly divided. So, Governor Hancock left, said he had gout, and he couldn't be in the debate anymore. So he thought he would just get out of the way. And without Hancock's support, there would be no ratification. So they said to Samuel West, you went to Harvard with him. They also went to Harvard with Dr. Church, the spy, remember? You went to Harvard. Go and tell John Hancock that he's got to come back and help with this. So there's a long speech that Samuel West gave to him to talk Hancock into coming and helping with the Constitution. And mostly the things he said to him were things to make Governor Hancock, benefits to John Hancock if he helped. See, like this: heaven had given Hancock another glorious opportunity by saving his country to win imperishable honor to himself, and the whole people would follow his footsteps with blessings. So Hancock, that sounded good to him, so he came right back into the room. He had himself carried in by servants wrapped in his flannels to the chair of the convention, and in his speech he did recommend the conciliatory amendments, some of which later became the basis for the Bill of Rights, and said, I give my assent to the Constitution in full confidence that the amendments proposed will soon become a part of the system, and a week later the Constitution was narrowly ratified. Now think about these people that say they had faith that the federal government would now make an amendment. They would vote the Constitution in because they believed the promises of the federal government to put those amendments in. And the thing is, in this case, the federal government did indeed do that. Okay. Next, yeah. So this was called the Massachusetts Compromise. And supposedly maybe it had backdoor promises to Hancock about his potential future as a vice president, which of course never came true. And Hancock was miraculously cured of his gout. And with the help of Sam Adams, he convinced the Massachusetts delegates that a Bill of Rights would be added following the ratification of the new Constitution. And while this compromise was a victory for the anti-federalists, those who really didn't believe in a strong central government, it also allowed those who did believe in the national government to gain the necessary number of states needed for the ratification of the Constitution. In July of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state, and so 9 out of 13 was enough to carry it. Okay. Now, this was what happened after that, after Massachusetts ratified it. In 1787, right about that time, John Leland got the Baptists in Virginia to vote for James Madison to go to the Virginia Convention to ratify the U.S. Constitution in turn for Madison's promise to pursue a federal religious liberty amendment. So they gave him votes. They traded votes for his promise. Okay. Now, we know the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This, I think, is my own feeling now. This is where I believe that people on the radio, on the talk shows, make such a mistake. Because the separation of church and state is not that the government doesn't believe in religion, or the people that staff the government or the staff the Congress don't believe in religion. It is that Congress can't make a law saying that you must believe or that you must have this religion or that religion, or to prohibit the free exercise thereof. And so there are some times when you pray at city council and you say, well, why should you pray at city council? Isn't there a separation of church and state? Well, if the people that are in the room want somebody to pray at city council, if you don't pray at city council, you're prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So we have to think very carefully what this First Amendment says and doesn't say. Well, Leland was a pivotal supporter of James Madison, and he helped win Baptist support for Madison's election to the first Congress. So now Madison has gone to Washington, where he drafted what would become the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So Backus also supported that First Amendment. So the first part was that there was a compromise here in Massachusetts that Samuel West helped out, that they would sign and ratify the Constitution if there would be a Bill of Rights. But the Baptists did not stop then. Then they went and made sure that what the Bill of Rights was going to say. So he supported the First Amendment, and he saw it as an extremely positive step for America, believing it would ensure a freedom for true religion. And the First Amendment, overwhelmingly supported by the Baptists, prevented a national church being formed, but left the individual states alone to decide for themselves. Well, in Massachusetts at that time, did we have a state church?
Yes.
Yes. We still had an established church. With all of this, the Church of Samuel West was still the established church, and even though people were going to the Quaker church and going to the Baptist church, and starting perhaps in an Episcopalian church and some Presbyterians perhaps here, the Congregational church was still the state church, but they were not enforcing the laws. That's what Massachusetts left it on the books, but they didn't really enforce it. So in
That's a question. It was enforced until 1833.
It wasn't enforced.
Well, we'll do some homework and we'll find what happened between 89 and 33.
It was still the established church.
Communities where there was a penalty for not supporting the local person.
So there were still towns in Massachusetts that was it town by town?
No,
Because it didn't happen here.
this is Dartmouth, and Dartmouth is dramatically different.
But it didn't happen in New Bedford either. I mean, it didn't happen in our area.
Down in Westport.
I'm talking western Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Okay,
Where
so
the
that's,
Congregational church was the dominant church anyway.
Yeah.
so if we come back next time to pick up where we stopped, we have to come back with the answer to that question. Good point, John. Okay, so in 1789, they started working on the Bill of Rights. Okay. Now, at the same time, and we said this last time, in 1780, Elder Daniel Hicks became the pastor of the First Church of Hicksville, which was a Baptist church. And this picture is not of the original meeting house or where they first had services, and nor in this part here. This part here was added since I'm pretty sure it was added since I moved to Dartmouth. It's the office, it's the elevator, it's better stairs for getting upstairs. And then downstairs it goes down to the Sunday school addition, which is really nice. But it was the best picture I had for today. Right now they need painting. This church does not look like this. It's the paint is just falling off. So I talked to Naomi Carney at the Dartmouth County facility who lines up who the inmates are and which churches they're going to paint every fall. She's trying to get them into October. But I believe that they would also, the church would have to come up with the money for the paint and for the brushes for the materials. Now, I haven't heard back from the church, but I would wish that the church would get in touch with us so that we could take up some kind of a collection for this. What really bothered me is when the pastor said, we've repainted it twice in the last 25 years. So that means even if we all pull together now and paint it once more now, that it's a good chance in my lifetime we're going to have to paint it again. So that's a question, but this is really one of the oldest buildings in Dartmouth, and so I think we need to support it. So what was Isaac Backus doing at the time? The thrust of his argument was that the Massachusetts tax exemptions granted to certain denominations violated the law of God. So that's part of what you're saying, John. Apparently the Congregationalists had tax breaks that the other churches didn't have. Because the government had assumed the right to determine those denominations it would tolerate and at what price, and those entitled to exemptions. So that would then be still part of that law that wasn't changed until 1833. Okay. Now, John Leland moved back to New England, where the Congregational Church still maintained its place as the established preferred church in both Massachusetts and Connecticut, and he fought to end religious establishment in both states, and saw Connecticut end establishment in 1818, and finally, at long last, in Massachusetts in 1833. And we're still at the end of the 1700s in our discussion. So this was a long time before Massachusetts, who was so keen on having a Bill of Rights on the national level, especially Article 1 that said that they can't make any laws against religion. And they just ignored it and went happily on having a law here. Now, you all know that the picture up there, we have it 1696. And you know that everybody questions whether that is the right answer. They know for sure the answer is by 1707 that the church at the head of the river was founded. But there are people like Franklin Howland who say there are enough people who say that there were Bible studies and meetings in people's homes in 1696 that we should take 1696 as the date. Well, down at the commerce is going down the Acushnet River. And so in 1794, the people in what is now today Fairhaven asked if they could have a meeting house for themselves. So many people had moved down there. And so do you know what this building is over here in 1794? Does that building look familiar to you?
Yeah, pharmacy used to be.
It's where Brown's Pharmacy used to be. Well, actually, it is.
So there's something to do with the Messiah.
That was across the street. That's good memory. That's right across the street. This was only one level, right here. And it faced this street, so it was across the street from Pumpernickel's, and its front door faced Pumpernickel's. But that is a meeting house that was built.
And in the background was the Congregational Church.
This church is the church that was built in 1844, which would be the next talk we have. So I wasn't going to mention it tonight, but you did well to spot it in the shadow.
I got married.
See, I had one of my students went and took the picture without showing the other church. This, I think, is one of the few places in America where, United States of America, where they built a church, and when they built the new church, they built it side by side, and both buildings are still in good repair and still being used. And what's very interesting about,
That's still there?
it's Euro. It's Euro. You know when you go and buy things from Euro across the street from Pumpernickel's?
Main Street and Center.
And up there is now the warehouse. Now, about 50 years ago, that was the dancing school for Fairhaven, because it had such a big hall, because that was the hall, the auditorium of the church before they raised it and put the pharmacy in under it. And when we finally get to the next church that was built in 1844, I'll talk about the architecture a little. Now, Pastor West preached every other Sunday, and in between, if he didn't, because now Pastor West is getting older, remember, and he was there for about 40 years, and when he took on the pastorship of this church, he could only go every other Sunday. So the people had to continue to walk to the head of the river. Even the people from here had to go the 11 miles if they wanted to go to that church. So they carried their shoes and they put on their shoes. Maybe they only had one pair, but they put their shoes on at a spot called Shoeing Rock. Have you ever heard of that? Nobody really knows where Shoeing Rock is, but there's only one road that goes up out of Oxford and goes up to Parting Ways, which is what is now called South Main. So I'd love to find that place where it was flat enough that everybody could sit down and put on their shoes, because that way they wouldn't spoil the shoe leather on the bottom by walking so far in them on Sunday. Now the next year, they built the Bedford Village Church, which became called the Third Precinct Church. Now, you know, some places, they call, like even in Louisiana, they call them parishes, which is where you got the word parish for Catholic churches having a diocese that's divided up into the cathedral and then the various parishes. Well, they divided everything up into precincts. And this was the Congregational Meeting House, which was on the corner of Purchase and William Street, and it used to be Merchants Bank. Was it Merchants Bank?
Merchants.
Merchants. Okay, so that was in 1795. But in about 1792, the New Bedford monthly meeting was set off from the Dartmouth monthly meeting with 204 members. So, in the 7th month, the preparative meeting was created at Allen's Neck, which was known as the West Preparative Meeting, and that meeting's still there. And by 1817, a meeting house had been built there, and one at Smith Neck by 1819. And then they united them all back into Dartmouth Monthly Meeting, and a new meeting house was completed early in the year at Newtown, which was occupied for 60 years, and it's removed, but the cemetery is still there. If you go to the Bank of America and go to Toyota on the road, is that Old Fons Corner Road, you can go by the Newtown, which is what North Dartmouth used to be called. You can see where the other meeting house was. And this was the meeting house downtown New Bedford, and you could tell it had a mirror image, you know, the women's door and the men's door and the same number of windows on each side. Now it's apartments. This is a picture of Smith Neck Friends. In 1819, the people over at Smith Neck thought it was a little far to keep going all the way to Apponeganset meeting to worship, and they put a little meeting house over there. And this is a picture from 1947. This is not the original. We don't have pictures, of course, from back then, but the way this meeting house that you go in this door here, you know, see how it has the two windows? Well, on the other side it has two windows, and it used to be turned on its side, and each of those windows, one was the men's door and one was the women's door. And then finally they turned it sideways, made all the pews go the same way, and put on the entryway. Then they built what they called the supper room. Well, now it's a bigger room. It's Fellowship Hall, and it has Sunday school area downstairs and the offices. But I thought that was a nice picture. And it says that it was the anniversary of when Caleb Anthony actually signed the deed, but he let them start in October 1819. Okay. Now, downtown New Bedford. This is when there was a start in the country of what was called the Second Great Awakening. And in the Second Great Awakening, following the First Great Awakening, many of the American denominations, the actual American churches, got started. You know, we brought Congregationalism, and to some extent Baptists, and Roman Catholics and Anglicans. Presbyterians are all kind of got their start in Europe. But then in this country, there were started some new denominations because of the tremendous, wonderful religious fervor. And so there were many churches started too at the same time. And so this Bedford Village Precinct got called New Bedford Precinct. And here is a picture by William Allen Wall. Now, you know that if you were looking at his other famous picture, which is the one on Union Street with the people going across in the people walking across, you know, the other, I wanted to put that picture in. But this is when you turn sideways and you look up Purchase Street, and there's the white church that I showed you before, which they didn't have William Street cut through. So right now, William Street comes right down beside here and goes across there, and Cherry and Webster BCC is right on this corner. Okay, next. Now, this is when we had the Unitarian controversy. So on the one hand, you're having the Second Great Awakening, and more people are believing in the gospel message as they perceive the Bible to be. At the same time as you're having some people that thought that the preaching of Jonathan Edwards, as you mentioned, was a little too much hellfire and brimstone. And so there were some people who began to believe that a person could work out their salvation and cooperate with God to become a Christian. These were called Arminians, after Jacob Arminius, more so than Calvin, who believed that God chose and elected and predestined those who were going to become Christians. And so those Arminians were then called Unitarians. And in one meeting you could have people that believed, several different things along this continuum. And the pulpit committee that was chosen to choose the next pastor had these more liberal Unitarian beliefs, these new beliefs. And they chose a minister who was like-minded with themselves. And so the Trinitarians broke away and built a church just north of that in 1810. And the Unitarians remained at the 3rd Precinct, the Bedford Village Meeting House. Now, many towns in the United States went through this. And you can tell which group outvoted the other group. If you were in, say, Lexington, Mass. On the green on April 19th, and you look across and you see the beautiful tall white spire that's in all the pictures that comes up behind Captain John Parker, that's the Unitarian Church. And nearby is the Hancock Congregational Church, which are the people that had to leave the Unitarian Church and build a new church. Now that's kind of what happened in New Bedford, but it does not appear that in New Bedford the Unitarians forced the Congregationalists to go. They chose to go. So, and of course this never happened in Fairhaven. In Fairhaven there was the one Congregational church that we saw, which was the 2nd Precinct. So let's see what the next slide is. This is...
Pam, what about the Universalists?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. I think more like 1850. We just have to go slow. We just never get through them all. This is a church not many people ever see a picture of. I don't know how long it was there, but it was very near to where the meeting house that I just showed you was, and it was near to where North Congregational was built. And some of you remember North Congregational downtown. That was near the cafeteria and the theater, and got taken down because the building, the walls got somewhat unstable when they took down the Empire Theater on one side of it and the Waldorf cafeteria on the other side. It made a split in some of the bearing walls of the church. But for a few years, the Congregationalists worshipped in that church. Okay. And the Friends meeting houses, I was trying to make a list. You can see that I didn't quite finish it. New Bedford First Meeting House was about 1792. Allen's Neck Meeting was 1761, but you saw that the date I had earlier was 1813. So we're going to have to work on this for our next talk, okay? So the Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival from 1790 to 1820, and many churches began in the old Dartmouth communities. Okay. And then, right after 1791, the Bill of Rights was finally ratified with the Religious Liberty Clause, and in 1833, Massachusetts became the final state to grant full religious liberty. Let's see what else we have here. Oh, Long Plain Baptist. Okay, so in 1795, the same as when they started the meeting house downtown in New Bedford, in Bedford Village, they held a public meeting for building a Baptist meeting house on the Long Plain, held at the residence of Deacon Silas Sweet. And the lot was on the west side of the road at the end of the Rochester Road. So it's very clear. It describes the location. So this is the location. At the end of the Rochester Road, you see the sign for 105, and left to Acushnet, and right to go up to Lakeville and Middleborough, and right behind it you see this vacant lot. And that was where the Long Plain Baptist Meeting House is, and the Long Plain Church now is with its nice day nursery is across the street. Okay, one more. Oh, wait a minute. Go another one. There. Now another way to look at it is if you go to Country Whip and you stand in the parking lot and you look beyond the house, that big tree that's the tree that was on Long Plain Baptist lot. Okay, let's go back. Go back. I skipped that just to, all right. Now here is what happened. John Leland came up to be a supply preacher at Long Plain. So one of the most important men in American history for religious liberty did not preach in a big church in downtown New Bedford or Fairhaven, one of the beautiful big churches. He went out and preached at Long Plain Baptist next to the Country Whip, which wasn't there then. So he was a very interesting man. He became famous for his media-savvy strategy to signal the Baptist support of the newly elected president in 1801. So you remember now, Jefferson and Madison were the two men that helped the Baptists push through their Amendment 1. So he decided he would he wanted to encourage the Baptists to support him, so he made cheese from the milk of 900 Republican cows. Now back then, you know, the Republicans were the Democrats and the Whigs were the Republicans. So I think these are, in our language, 900 Democrat cows. But the cheese measured 4 foot in diameter, 13 feet in circumference, and weighed 1,200 pounds. And across it was, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," Jefferson's famous motto. And as the giant cheese took a month-long journey from Western Mass to Washington, D.C., they ridiculed it and called it the Mammoth Cheese. And on January 1st, 1802, Jefferson welcomed Leland and his flamboyant gift into the White House, and 2 days later he delivered the Sunday sermon in the House of Representatives with the president in attendance, just like the famous television evangelists do today. Okay, so I wanted, this is how the Congregational Church of South Dartmouth got started, because this was just about the same time. Everything happened in 1807. The first Congregational church erected in the village was organized in 1807, and the building built between 1816 and 1821. Now, by now, if you lived in Dartmouth, you didn't have to walk all the way up to Acushnet, of course, to go to church if you were a Congregationalist, because you could just walk downtown to the Bedford Village precinct. But they started, or you could ride your horse. So they had a church here, organized by Reverend Curtis Coe, the Reverend Mace Shepherd, and several, but Joseph Packard was the deacon, and David Thatcher was the scribe. And they called a man named Reverend Daniel Emerson of Hollis, New Hampshire. Has anyone ever heard of Hollis? Well, Hollis is a little town in New Hampshire that is as close as, I'm going from the Fort Taber to downtown New Bedford. That's how close this town in New Hampshire is to Massachusetts. And if you're up there riding your bike, as I used to when I was a child, you could be in New Hampshire or in Massachusetts and never know, because they didn't put entering on all the road signs. So in Hollis, New Hampshire, there was a man, there was a pastor, and his grandson, well, his son became the deacon of the church at Hollis, and his grandson was this young man who went to Harvard and studied in law and left to engage in a successful mercantile business. And after his conversion, he abandoned his flattering worldly prospects. This is what the history of the Congregational Church of South Dartmouth says, for the gospel ministry, and was called to the pastoral office here, the first and last which he filled, and he was here for a year. See, the church was organized in 1807, and he died in 1808. And how many of you know where his tombstone is in the South Dartmouth Cemetery? Judy Lund, of course, has a wonderful rubbing of it. And you can read her rubbing and you can see exactly what it says. I couldn't get a very good picture of it. I did try. But it reads, "His disposition was singularly mild, his deportment lovely, his judgment sound, his labors assiduous, and his death triumphant. And he left his wife and all his children." And he'd only been here a year. So she took all her children and she went back home to Hollis, to where her in-laws were, and lived in Hollis for the rest of her life. And eventually the house that she lived in there became the parsonage of the Hollis Church. Well, the other thing that was interesting to me about the Emersons was, this is the family of Emersons. They were, a whole bunch of them were ministers. Ralph Waldo Emerson, was a minister, and the first, my family came from the town of Pepperell, which was right on the border of Hollis, right on the border of New Hampshire. And the first pastor and the first church was started in 1742, which, as you can see, is 60 years sooner than this one here in Dartmouth. And that pastor was an Emerson. Took me a long time to find out.
Ralph Waldo Emerson was substitute pastor at the Unitarian.
That's
Church
right.
in New Bedford
That's
in
right.
1830.
That's right. So
What convinced him to get out of the ministry?
maybe become a poet, right?
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, so Ralph Waldo, I can't remember whether he is a second cousin or an uncle, but the pastor in the Pepperell Church was the great-great-uncle
Yeah,
of the
and-
one
and
down
there-
here.
There was a minister in Little Compton, I think it was Emerson Payne, but he was.
It's a
related.
great family of all the different Emerson, and so I thought I'd mention him to you. So I think that when we began this evening, we were talking about how far one would have to walk from Russell's Mills, from this schoolhouse area to what is now Acushnet, if one wanted to worship at the precinct church in the congregational tradition. But we end now with one would only have to walk to Padenham Village, because by now the Congregational Church of South Dartmouth, as we call it now, was built. And mostly our talk tonight was not about the local churches, but about the wider area of faith throughout the colonies that became the United States, and how we had freedom of faith through the efforts of the Baptists and of Thomas Jefferson and of Madison. So what we have to say is that the next time we get together, we'll be talking about the local churches right within the boundaries of Old Dartmouth.